The melee meta for raids is here now, with Amir Drasil being over and we having data for all 3 raids, although probably Amir Drasil is more relevant. Everybody knows their damage profile. We all know who's the best DPS, who's the most survivable spec in the game in terms of melee at the very least. And how much do all of the buffers in terms of the bullion items, the tier sets, the legendaries affect the overall rankings of all the melees in the game, and does all of that matter in the end? Spoiler alert, it does. It's performance, of course. We're looking at the raw numbers. And speaking of raw, there's no more raw spec than Arms, I gotta tell you, because Arms right now is crushing it. D tier, no. C tier, no. B tier, no. A tier, no. S tier, baby. Arms is S tier. Oh my god, what's going on with Arms? Currently, right now, I think it's the best melee spec in the raid by overall Warcraft log standards. Is it the best on Farak as well? Probably. I mean, you're seeing it on the screen right now. I've gone through so much data. I tend to kind of mix them a little bit. And Arms has been doing pretty well in Aberrus as well. So that's pretty good for it when it comes to everything that Arms is doing. Not to mention that Arms is probably, or almost probably, the perfect raid spec. It has insane burst in terms of, you know, starting the fight, everybody pops Bloodlust, you just go, go, go. It destroys. Not to mention it does have the best execute in the game, which is how things should be, as opposed to how it was last year, where it was pretty good, but I don't remember if it was the best. I think Shadow Priest kind of had something to say about that. But Arms right now is destroying on 2 of the best aspects of a raid DPS, and that is burst and execute, and it's perfect. The probably biggest and only real issue is that it's one of the squishiest melee specs in the game, but that doesn't stop it from destroying the meters, and that's, you know, what really matters at the end of the day. Also our stream, because on twitch.tv/Marcelian&Online you can go and see us raid with you, because that's something that happens on our stream. Not to mention that with our stream we usually use to test all of the alpha that were within specs live and discuss all of the class reworks, not to mention all of the news in terms of WoW, and play with you guys, not only raids but also keys. And we're gonna have a surprise for everybody in about a week's time when it comes to the streams, and you might want to at least drop a follow on our Twitch, because it's gonna be spicy. It's gonna be here on YouTube live as well, but Twitch as well. Now, with that out of the way, let's talk about Assassination, because I'm gonna rank Assassination first, since I do want to invoke the outrage of the comment section, because Assassination is S tier. I don't know either, man. I don't know why. I mean, it did receive a 6% buff, which is probably not really the main contributor, though it does actually help. It's also likely based on the gear. I mean, Assassination has been really good in terms of its rework and how it approaches boss. It used to be the best burst spec in the game prior to them being nerfed before 10.2 released. So now we're probably seeing kind of some of those nerfs being reverted. If 6% is enough, then yay, I would be surprised. But right now, Assassination is the burstiest spec in the game, period. If you look at how it approaches a pool of the boss with Bloodlust and everything up in the game, it just fucking knocks Unholy out of the park. I mean, at least it gives it a run for its money. Now, in terms of the overall performance, it's clear a big difference between how Assassination is now and how it was in Aberrus, because it was a little bit lackluster in Aberrus, so you could probably say that the buffs are doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And not to mention, similar to Arms, it has a really strong execute, because Zoldyck talent and the arterial precision as well, builds that I've seen people work on, at least on Farak. And having access to caustic spatter, you have access to really easy AoE at the sacrifice of a little bit of single target on fights like Farak, which is where most of our data is being pulled from, since it's the most relevant data, considering that now it's essentially when everybody just is fully decked out. They had enough time to get all their eye levels, all their tier sets, everything upgraded, all their bullions, and now just being able to clear Farak on Mythic is probably one of the biggest standards to fulfill as a DPS spec. And Assassination does all of this without PIs. How about that? Speaking of no PIs, Outlaw is one of the specs that I couldn't find a log with PIs, which is great because that's really what you want. You don't really want to be reliant on external power systems like power infusion, and Outlaw is the king of consistent damage across the board. It's not enough to bring it into S tier, but it is enough to put it into A tier because overall damage is still not that great. And since it's the king of consistency, it doesn't really have amazing burst or any execute as far as I know. It does have some pretty sweet raid AoE whenever you need those adds to die, because having access to Blade Flurry is pretty cheap for Outlaw as opposed to what other specs have to go through to get access to their AoE. And even if you think that, you know, Outlaw is a one-trick pony, it's just doing AoE and people just let Outlaw do all of the AoE and they just focus on a single target, that's not really true. Because if you look right here and this particular frog fight where Outlaw just has these big schlongs in the middle where basically the adds spawn, everybody essentially is doing AoE. The Warlocks using their Rain of Fires, the Warriors using their Thunderous Roars, Shadow Priests having their Psychic Links up. So it's not just that Outlaw is the only one doing AoE. Everybody does AoE and Outlaw just does it better without having to sacrifice as much single target as most of these specs like for instance Survival Hunter, which unfortunately as opposed to Outlaw it's not doing that great. It's going to go into C tier because whether or not the damage profile of Survival is good, the overall throughput is just bad. I think this probably just needs a buff because we have looked at, let's say, a Farok log for Survival that does just pure single target, just pure spearhead, go wailing on the boss, which is normally something that Survival excels at in raids, single target boss damage that is. And also an AoE version of that Survival with explosive shot, with a lot of bombs and all of that stuff, going ham on the adds. And the performance is fairly similar. And the overall damage profile seems to be fairly similar. So I couldn't really tell which one is better. I would probably go towards the single target version of Survival because boss damage at the end of the day is the most important thing. Oh, and one other weird thing is that Bloodlust windows don't seem to really affect Survival that much, which Bloodlust used to be like the king in making Survival destroy bosses. Maybe it's just the end of the season, maybe everybody just capped on haste and a little bit more haste from Bloodlust doesn't really mean that much, so that could be a thing. Enhancement, however, is what you would get if Survival actually had damage, because Enhancement is all the way up into A tier. Now, I don't know if it's doing better. I think it's doing better than Outlaw, actually, so I want to put it in front of Outlaw. And the damage profile is just better. It has consistent high damage across the board, a little bit more than Outlaw. It has high survivability, weirdly enough. It's actually second to Outlaw. I think Outlaw's #1, which is weird because you wouldn't think Enhancement would be that tanky to begin with. And that's pretty much it. There's actually no real redeeming factors for Enhancement. Even though it has high damage, it doesn't have it the highest, it doesn't have really good executes or any execute whatsoever. It doesn't really have that great burst. It's okay. I mean, it's A tier. It's nothing to sneeze at, but, you know, there's a while until Enhancement can get all the way to ARMS levels of performance. Feral is also kind of like a little bit of an underwhelming story. It has decent damage, it's a little bit below the rest of the specs. It also doesn't really have any redeeming qualities in terms of its damage profile. Like, what does Feral bring to the raid outside of it being a druid? Prior to this, in 10.2, Feral was one of the best boss damage specs in the game with how it funneled all of that into big fat bites. Now, Ferals just seem to go Giga single target on Farok, which is kind of what they did before, but they don't seem to be pulling the numbers anymore. And to be fair, it feels fairly reliant on Berserk. Now, that's actually not a bad thing because Berserk windows just give it a lot of burst, and you can see here all of these big spikes in its damage profile are essentially all Berserk damage, and doesn't seem like the Bloodlust side of the things changes much for Feral's performance. I think even while Bloodlust is up, Feral just kind of dips a little bit as soon as Berserk ends, which maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. Being reliant on cooldowns is not a bad thing considering that you want specs to be bursty in raids, but it's just enough to get it into B tier. It's not quite as bad as Survival yet, but it's not quite up in the upper echelons of the damage profile specs. A big surprise has been Frost DK this season, which we kind of see it do stuff like this at the beginning of a tier where it just destroys the early raids, and it's doing way better than Enhancement and Outlaw, which is something that I wouldn't have guessed if you would have asked me. And weirdly enough, it's also doing that well with both of the builds, because that's always a thing to discuss in raids, whether you should take Breath of Sindragosa or Obliteration. Prior to this, Obliteration was kind of consistently way better than Breath, but if we're gonna take a fight like Farok, where the damage profile is all across the board, you do have adds. If you look at this particular Breath log and Breath damage profile, it does really well. It does very high burst, and definitely when adds pop up, you see the big spike in the middle. Also, the same thing can be said about Obliteration, because it still has the exact same thing. Now, Breath does a little bit more damage than Obliteration, but it does come with the caveat of being a little bit more restrictive, a little bit more conditional to the fact that you have to stick to the goddamn boss, which maybe it's not that hard on Farok after all of these months of practice, but if you don't want the headache of that, picking Obliteration will still net you pretty good damage across the board. Fury Warrior has been a sad case up until the buffs have hit just earlier last week, I believe, and with those buffs, it's actually cranking. It's currently the best A-tier spec that we have, and is doing really well. It's actually still quite a way away from ARMS in terms of the overall performance. Its burst is probably maybe slightly better overall because it has access to way more burst windows, but its execute is not nearly as high enough. And similar to, I think this is a trend for the A-tier specs, in AoE it just explodes. It might just have the biggest AoE burst in terms of raid add damage from what we see in the current logs. And it's also just a way better version of Outlaw in terms of the consistency king and AoE damage. Probably because it kind of lost the old tier set and now it has the Bloodthirst set, although yeah, I suppose that works. I mean, it brought it back into A tier, which is good. Similarly, Havoc is also a better version of Fury because it is, I think, the #1 spec on Farok at the moment. So I'm going to put it in front of Fury. I think Fury overall might do better in raids, period, but Havoc just has these fights, these niches, where it's just a better version of it. Not to mention that the utility that Havoc brings to a raid is superior to a warrior, period. So if you're going to have two very, very close specs like Fury and Havoc, then you're probably going to want a Havoc because it does bring the debuff, since I don't even know Vengeance is the best tank in raid anymore, but it does bring an extra darkness, which is really good, and the extra mobility, and the CC that, you know, Fury kind of has to sacrifice some damage for it, and Havoc doesn't really, because Chaos Nova is a little bit more accessible. Now, all of the consistency in the damage that it has is kind of compensated by the fact that it has almost no execute whatsoever. And you can see that even though Havoc is really good across the board, once execute hits, it will a little bit dip. So maybe that's why it doesn't make it all the way into S tier yet. That's not the case for Retribution, which is the S tier spec. Now, I don't know if I want to put it in front or behind ARMS. I think it's been the king for a while. Overall, I'm going to put it in front. It's probably a better spec than ARMS because I think Red is actually the perfect DPS spec for raids, or at least the perfect melee DPS spec for raids. It has super high consistent damage, higher than ARMS. It has super high burst across the board and super high execute across the board. Now, it doesn't have more execute than ARMS, it doesn't have more burst than Assassination, and the high consistency is probably higher than Havocs and Furies and Outlaws across the board, which is probably why it's there. It does not super excel in everything or in any one of these categories as opposed to other specs in the tier list, but it has all of them, whereas ARMS probably has burst and execute. It doesn't have consistency, and Havoc has consistency but doesn't have burst and execute. Red just has all of it. It's kind of like the Vengeance spec of the raid, where you just have access to all the tools that you need to be actually a good raid spec, which is something that if you would have said this about Red an expansion ago, 2 expansions ago, 3 expansions ago, people would have probably laughed in your face. So it's a long time coming, Red Paladin players, so you enjoy it while it lasts. I actually don't know if it's going to be bad in the War Within, but Subtlety has fallen from being probably one of the best specs last year to probably being one of the worst specs this year. I actually have no idea what's going on with Subtlety because not much changed. The tier set is the same, the gear is mostly the same. It might have had some nerfs, I cannot really remember, but on Smolderon it was the king, and on Smolderon right now it's no longer the king. Damage tuning is just way off for Subtlety. It does seem to excel in little burst windows of Shadow Dance, which that's great, and if you can match them with stuff like ads on Farok, then you will actually do a really consistent high amounts of damage, especially with, you know, having easy access to black powder as opposed to other specs that have to talent heavily into AoE. Even with all of that, it's still, I cannot see it higher than C tier. I cannot even see it closer to Feral than it is to Survival. So that may be something that we need to look into going forward into the rest of the season. Unholy is the PI master. Who is your Lord and Savior, Unholy? PI? Was that right? Did I hear that correctly? Because holy shit. I don't know if Unholy has better burst than Assassination or not. I don't think it has better execute, but its heavy reliance on power infusion is why it's actually not better than Assassination, since Assassination does close to what Unholy does, but without any PI. And not to mention that PI just makes Unholy just like a totally different spec. And you can look here at all the damage spikes that Unholy has across the entire fight. All of them coincide with power infusion. Weirdly enough, even though you do get Bloodlust eventually, it doesn't affect it as much as just getting power infusion timed with all of your cooldowns, because that is actually why that's good, because you can have Bloodlust. And Unholy is probably going to do really well if you pop Bloodlust at the beginning of the fight with PI and your cooldowns, and you're just a monster. I actually don't think Assassination can match that whatsoever, but across the board, power infusion being matched with the timing of your cooldowns just turns Unholy into a wholly different spec. Definitely S tier material as of now. Things might change, but after all of the 3 raids that we've had, Unholy is crushing it. And last but not least, Windwalker is one of the more interesting specs to analyze in terms of the overall performance. And I'm going to put Windwalker into A tier. It's not quite S tier, but there's a couple of things that I want to mention about Windwalker, and we're going to have some data for you on the screen right now. First of all, Windwalker, if we're going about the overall damage output of Windwalkers or all of the specs in the game across the entire raid, just like an average, Windwalker has the best. Even if it's just by a little, Windwalker does have the best overall damage performance across the board in all of the raid. Maybe that can be the king of consistency, if you will. Now, it's also top on Farok with Arms and Havoc in terms of the overall performance of a spec. It's also very close to S tier in terms of overall performance, period. And if you really want to go really nitty-gritty with all of it, if you look at how, let's say, Archon.gg ranks all of the specs based on damage performance, everybody's S tier. S tier for you, S tier for you, S tier for you. But Windwalker, similar to Red, has gone a long way into being one of the worst raid melee specs in the game, with some of the worst single target possible, to being not that bad, actually. Close to being S tier. Quite not S tier yet, because it doesn't have those, oh my god, it's really good at this thing. No, it's just good across the board, but not amazing at anything particularly that you would want from a melee spec in a raid. As opposed to what Mythic Plus offers the melee DPS meta, which you can check here in our video, where we have analyzed the data for Mythic Plus performance for all of the melee and have come to a conclusion. What is that conclusion? Well, you can watch this without skipping to the end and just watching the overall ranking, goddammit, come on, man.